Christmas in my Montana town usually arrives with a calm that settles over everything, and that same calm made the moment I learned the truth feel even more devastating. My name is Simone, and that evening I was sitting on the floor of my parents' small house wrapping the gifts I had spent the entire month saving for, while trying to believe the holiday season might still carry a little warmth for me. I opened the window slightly to let the room breathe as I folded the last sheet of wrapping paper. Before I could process anything, voices drifted up from the front yard right as a car pulled in. It took only a heartbeat for me to recognize that tone, the sharp tone that always appeared whenever the subject was me. My hands went still when my sister's words shot straight through the cold air. "I don't want to spend Christmas with that useless loser." The sentence landed so heavily that even the wrapping paper seemed to weigh more. A moment later, my father's voice followed, tired and resigned, as if he had repeated the same line far too many times. "Just tolerate him a little longer until he finishes paying for the house renovation." I froze. For months, I had been paying for the repairs because I was told the house needed urgent work before winter arrived. Hearing the truth spoken with such ease made my chest burn and then turn cold within seconds. I gently closed the window so the paper would not scatter, and I sat there long enough to feel every word settle into place. And then Christmas came. The house still was not repaired. Creditors showed up at the door, and at that moment the person they always called useless was gone. Before we get into my story, tell me what time it is where you are watching and which city you are in, so I can see how far this story has traveled. Before those words ever reached my window, everything had begun quietly at the start of winter. Montana can turn unforgiving as soon as the temperature drops, and the first sign of snow usually means families hurry to prepare their homes. That year, Mom called me one evening with a voice that carried worry I did not question. She said the electrical system in the house had been flickering for days, and she feared the cold would make the situation worse. The way she described it made it sound urgent enough that I did not hesitate to ask what needed to be done. Mom told me the company warned her that faulty wiring could cause outages during heavy storms, which would be dangerous for her and Dad. She said the house needed repairs quickly because the system was old, and the cost would be more than she expected. I remember asking why the issue had not been dealt with earlier, and she said life had been difficult, so they had postponed it until they could no longer ignore it. She rarely asked me for anything directly, which made the request feel serious, and I told myself helping them was the right thing to do while winter approached. The first payment I sent covered an inspection that Mom insisted was necessary before the repair. I transferred the money and tried not to think too much about the strain it placed on my budget. My sister Barrett knew about the issue because Mom had told her as well, yet she never offered to contribute, and Mom defended her immediately whenever I hinted that the responsibility should not fall entirely on me. She would say Barrett had her own struggles, or that she was already doing more than enough in ways that were not visible to me. I wanted to believe it, although I never saw any evidence that supported those claims. More requests arrived as the weeks passed. Mom said the electrician found additional issues that needed immediate attention, and each time she contacted me, the urgency in her voice grew. I had been trying to save for my own expenses, but every call from her chipped away at the small safety net I was building. I kept sending the money because she always reminded me that the house was still my childhood home and that she and Dad were doing their best. Dad barely spoke to me during this period, and I assumed he was letting Mom handle everything because she had always been the one who managed household matters. The more I transferred, the tighter things became for me. I cut back on eating out and canceled several plans with friends, telling them I was trying to be responsible with my finances. Only one friend, Jody, knew I had been supporting my parents extensively. She told me to be careful, but I brushed it off and said family needed to step up when things became difficult. I convinced myself the discomfort I felt was temporary and that the repairs would be finished soon. It never crossed my mind that the situation might not be what I believed. By the time winter settled deeply over the town, I had already sent several payments and tried to stay optimistic. I told myself the stress was worth it, because my parents would finally have a safe home for the season. I tried to picture the house warm and steady with Mom no longer sounding anxious whenever she spoke to me. That image kept me moving forward, even as I watched my bank account shrink to a level that made me nervous. The morning after that conversation arrived with a weight I could feel before even opening my eyes. I woke with the awareness that every assumption I once relied on might no longer hold, and that whatever I chose to do next needed to come from clarity rather than fear. I took a slow breath before sitting up because I sensed that rushing into the day would only make the thoughts from last night press harder against me. I made a cup of tea and opened my banking app, allowing my eyes to follow the long trail of transfers that stretched back through the previous months. Each payment carried the same simple memo about repairs, yet the repetition created a pressure behind my ribs that I could not ignore. I enlarged a few old receipts and wrote down each date so I could review them more thoroughly. As I compared the information, I noticed inconsistencies that caused my pulse to rise, despite my efforts to stay calm. While I was still examining the records, Mom answered a call in the living room. Her tone carried an urgency she rarely showed to anyone in the family, and something about that shift made me pause. I stayed behind the half-closed door and placed my phone on audio record because I needed to understand exactly what had been happening instead of relying on fragmented guesses. Mom spoke about renovation updates, but the conversation did not resemble what she had been telling me for weeks. She mentioned delays that contradicted the invoices I held and referred to amounts that had never appeared in my transfers. I listened carefully as she discussed an electrician whose name had never once shown up on any bill. She referred to an additional payment she claimed would cover winter protection, yet I already knew that part of the house had been inspected and cleared months earlier. The call lasted long enough for me to gather several details that deepened my suspicion. When she finally hung up, I replayed the recording with headphones to ensure I caught every word accurately. I returned to the kitchen table and created a list of each discrepancy. The more I wrote, the more I understood that none of this could be dismissed as misunderstanding. I felt a mix of betrayal and disappointment settle inside me because I had believed in the urgency Mom described. I remembered the nights she told me that the house could lose power at any moment if repairs were not handled immediately, yet the invoices suggested that only minor checks had been completed. The largest payment I had made had not been used for electrical work at all, which left me staring at my notes in disbelief. Despite everything, I chose not to confront anyone. I needed more than fragments and contradictions. I reviewed the messages Mom had sent about scheduling repairs and compared them to the timestamps on her recorded call. The gaps were substantial enough to suggest that she had been repeating the same narrative to maintain control over the situation. I closed my notebook and tried to steady my thoughts because I sensed that the truth was only beginning to surface. I spent the rest of the morning gathering every receipt I could find, including a few archived emails I had nearly forgotten about. Each document added another layer to the picture forming in front of me. I realized that I had been financing far more than what had ever been disclosed. My savings had diminished rapidly, yet neither Mom nor Barrett had offered to contribute, despite knowing how much strain I was under. Even Dad had avoided discussing the repairs directly, which now felt intentional. By early afternoon, I understood that the only way to navigate what was unfolding was to continue documenting every inconsistency quietly. I closed my laptop and allowed a moment for the weight of the morning to settle because I knew that once I began following the evidence fully, there would be no turning back. A week later, I walked into the local office of the electric company with a determination that felt heavier than the cold air outside. A clerk at the reception desk directed me to a technician, and that was when I met Leonard, the staff electrician, who had handled most service calls across our neighborhood. I introduced myself and explained that I needed to verify a series of payments connected to my parents' house. Leonard studied the dates I provided, then opened his records with a thoughtful seriousness that made me feel both nervous and strangely validated. He scrolled through several screens before he pressed his lips together with a quiet hesitation. The first thing he told me was that no major electrical repairs had been scheduled during the months I had been transferring money. His voice held a careful tone as he explained that the only documented work involved a minor inspection and a reset panel cleaning, which cost significantly less than what I had been told. My stomach tightened when he said Mom had rescheduled 2 appointments but had never completed the larger repairs she claimed were urgent. I asked him to check again, hoping I had misunderstood something, yet he confirmed the information with the same steady manner. Leonard printed a detailed service summary for me and lowered his voice as he pointed to the payment section. The account listed for scheduled repairs had no record of any advance deposits. I remembered the messages Mom sent about paying in increments and stared at the paper long enough for the numbers to blur. He mentioned that if any third party had been paid, it had not gone through the company. That quiet remark told me more than he probably realized. I thanked Leonard for his time and stepped outside where I opened my banking app before the door had even closed. I reviewed the transfers once more and compared them with the service summary in my hand. The discrepancy was undeniable. It felt surreal to stand in the parking lot and realize that the urgency I had responded to for months had never existed. The weight of that realization settled slowly, as if every transaction I had ever made was now asking me to justify why I believed so easily. At home, I examined the receipts Mom had forwarded over the past seasons. Several were legitimate, but others did not match any of the work Leo showed me. The inconsistency stretched even further when I noticed that some receipts were cropped screenshots without verification codes. I opened my laptop and searched through earlier bank statements which revealed multiple transactions to stores Mom frequented, including beauty boutiques and a loan service she had mentioned once in passing. The pattern formed with a clarity that made my chest feel tight. I created a folder labeled for documentation and organized every piece of evidence I had gathered. The more I sorted, the clearer my next step became. I logged into the joint maintenance account and reviewed the balances that had shrunk rapidly throughout the year. For the first time, I noticed notifications I had dismissed earlier because I trusted the explanations given to me. Each alert now seemed like a warning I should have questioned. I transferred the remaining funds to my personal account and removed my access from the shared financial platform. I took screenshots of the transaction history and saved every message that referenced repairs which I knew I would need later. I kept my actions quiet because tension was growing inside me in a way that demanded careful planning rather than immediate confrontation. When I finally closed my laptop, the realization settled that I was no longer contributing to anything uncertain. I would not fund another fabricated emergency, nor would I continue supporting decisions I had been excluded from. I sat still long enough to let that clarity replace the confusion that had followed me for weeks, because the truth had reached a point where silence carried more power than any conversation I could start. That afternoon, my phone vibrated nonstop, and I knew the quiet hours I had tried to carve out for myself were over the moment I saw Mom's name flashing across the screen. I let the first few calls ring out because I needed a moment to steady my thoughts, yet she kept calling with a rapid insistence that told me something significant had shifted on her end. When the ringing finally stopped, a text appeared with the same urgency that had been pulsing through every call. Mom wrote that she had just received a notice from the electric company about an additional penalty fee attached to the overdue balance. Her message was disjointed and full of attempts to create sympathy, although I sensed more fear than frustration. She kept insisting that something must have gone wrong with the automatic payments, claiming she never missed a deadline. I read her messages twice to make sure I was not imagining how quickly she had moved from confidence to panic, and I could almost picture her pacing while trying to decide what explanation might convince me to step back into the role she expected. Before I could decide how to respond, another call came through, and the name on the screen made my jaw tighten. Barrett's voice cut through the line the instant I answered, and she did not bother to hide her irritation. She demanded to know what I had done, claiming that Mom was overwhelmed and that the household was falling apart because of my actions. I held the phone to my ear and allowed her anger to spill out until she reached the accusation she had clearly rehearsed. "You just want to ruin everything, don't you?" Her words did not surprise me as much as the speed with which she hurled them. I waited a moment because I wanted my response to land with clarity rather than emotion. When she paused to catch her breath, I spoke with a steadiness that felt new even to me. "Ask Mom what she said last night." There was a sudden silence across the line, and I knew she had not expected me to say anything that pointed back to the conversation I had overheard. She muttered that she had no idea what I was talking about, although her voice carried an unsteady note that betrayed her confusion. Before she could regain her footing, I told her I needed to take another call and ended the conversation without waiting for her reply. Mom resumed calling within seconds, and her tone shifted the moment I picked up. She tried to sound wounded as she explained that the penalty fee would create a larger problem if it remained unpaid. She reminded me of how much stress she had been under, and she emphasized the danger of letting the balance escalate right when the temperatures were continuing to drop. Her approach blended guilt, fear, and convenience in a way that felt familiar. Yet this time, I listened with a distance that surprised even me. When I told her I no longer had access to the joint account she had relied on for household expenses, her voice rose in disbelief. She insisted that I must have misunderstood something and urged me to transfer a temporary amount to buy her time to straighten things out. I answered in a calm tone because I wanted her to hear the resolve shaping every word I said. I told her I could not continue supporting a system that operated on secrecy and selective truth. She tried to interrupt me several times, yet I continued speaking until her resistance turned into a quiet plea. I ended the call once she realized I would not shift my position, and I set my phone aside because I needed to regain the mental clarity that had been disrupted by the back and forth. The evening deepened outside while the house remained still, and I understood that their growing panic was only the beginning of what awaited them. 3 days later, Mom appeared at my doorstep without giving any warning, and the sight of her standing there with stiff shoulders told me she had prepared a story long before she knocked. I opened the door because I wanted to hear whatever explanation she believed would shift the blame away from her choices, and I kept my phone recording from the moment she walked inside. She stepped past me and looked around as if searching for a version of me that might be softer or more forgiving, although my silence seemed to unsettle her more than raised voices ever could. Mom began speaking rapidly, claiming that the situation with the electric company had been exaggerated and that the entire billing problem had resulted from a clerical error. She described the penalty fees as unnecessary complications and insisted that she had been handling everything responsibly. Her tone rose with each sentence, yet she avoided mentioning the conversation she had with Barrett in the driveway because she assumed I still knew nothing about it. I listened with a calm restraint that seemed to make her more nervous, and she shifted between frustration and sweetness, as if a change in approach might create sympathy. When she paused and waited for a reaction, I said what I had been waiting to say. "I heard every word, Mom." The color in her face changed almost instantly, and she struggled to understand how much I had actually heard. She tried to deny it and insisted that she had never said anything unkind about me. Her voice trembled when she claimed she would never manipulate my willingness to help the family. Yet the panic in her eyes made it clear she knew denial was the weakest strategy she could use. I let her continue for another minute because I wanted the recording to capture every contradiction she offered before I presented the evidence. When I played the audio clip of her conversation with Barrett, the room turned heavy with a kind of silence that only truth could create. Mom's expression tightened as she listened to her own voice instructing Barrett to tolerate me until I finished paying for the renovation. She tried to claim the recording was taken out of context, yet even she could hear how hollow the defense sounded. I watched her struggle to rebuild the narrative she had relied on for months, while the facts sat between us with undeniable clarity. Before she could speak again, my phone lit up with an incoming call from Barrett. I answered on speaker because I had no intention of shielding anyone from the truth. Barrett sounded irritable from the start, and the tension in her voice cracked when she realized Mom was standing in my home. She accused me of creating chaos and claimed that Mom had been under unbearable pressure. Her frustration built until she returned to the accusation she favored when she sensed her control weakening. "You just want to ruin everything, don't you?" Her words no longer held any weight, and I felt a steadiness in my voice that had grown stronger each day since the moment I overheard them in the driveway. I told Barrett the same line I had given her earlier. "Ask Mom what she said last night." Mom inhaled sharply at the reminder, and Barrett hesitated long enough for me to understand that she recognized my refusal to accept their version of events. When I hung up, Mom tried to shift into pleading, asking me to reconsider the financial support she depended on. She insisted that the timing was unfortunate and that the stress of the season had created misunderstandings. I stood near the doorway because I wanted her to understand that the conversation was moving toward its conclusion. I told her I would no longer contribute any money to the household and that the decisions she made with the funds were her responsibility alone. My tone remained even because I no longer needed height or volume to express the boundary I had chosen. Mom tried once more to appeal to sympathy, yet she realized I had already stepped back from the cycle she created. When she finally left, the air in the room settled with a quietness that felt unfamiliar but necessary. For the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of their expectations lifting. Christmas night finally arrived, and the stillness in the air felt heavier than any winter I remembered. I drove toward my Aunt Marcy's house after finishing my shift at the clinic, trying to hold on to a sense of peace, even though I knew the evening would unfold very differently at my parents' place. Snow drifted across the road, and the glow from the porch lights along the neighborhood softened the landscape in a way that made the quiet almost deceptive. The serenity did not last once the phone in my coat began vibrating. I let it ring, because I had already decided how the night would unfold for me, though a part of me sensed something had gone terribly wrong. When I reached my Aunt Marcy, who had always been the one adult in the family, I trusted her warm hug grounded me. She ushered me inside, telling me to sit by the fireplace while she finished setting the table. The room was filled with gentle music and the scent of cinnamon, which created a calm I had not felt in weeks. Mom's fifth call finally forced me to look at the screen, and the moment I answered, I heard a mix of panic and accusation. Her voice trembled each time she tried to raise it because the temperature inside their house had dropped fast. She told me the power had been shut off despite the pleas she made to the company earlier that week. She demanded to know what I had done, though I reminded her that I had paid the portion she claimed was still pending. Barrett was shouting in the background, and the noise of her frustration seeped through the line even before she grabbed the phone. She asked if I intended to humiliate them on Christmas. She insisted that the cold was unbearable, and her complaints grew sharper once she realized the company would not restore anything until the following week. She expected me to apologize, though she never paused long enough for me to speak. I kept my voice steady because I had nothing to correct or defend. Dad called immediately after they hung up, and the weight in his breathing told me everything. He asked if the things Mom had said last night were true. I confirmed what I had heard without embellishing details. The silence that followed was longer than any pause we had shared before, and I felt something within him shift. He realized that the repairs he believed were necessary had never been scheduled, and the funds I had transferred had been spent elsewhere. He thanked me for answering calmly, and even though his voice faltered, he did not blame me for the consequences they now faced. While I sat by the fire with my Aunt Marcy, the rest of the neighborhood became aware of the situation at my parents' home. Their house stood completely dark while every other window on the street glowed with warm lights and decorations. In Montana's winter conditions, a home without heat became a topic people noticed quickly, and the questions spread faster than Mom could control. She called several neighbors to ask for help, but none were willing to offer space or money because each of them remembered moments from the past when she had either ignored their difficulties or boasted about her supposed resilience. Barrett eventually drove to a friend's house, though no one offered to let her stay longer than a few hours, once they understood how the bill had accumulated. Mom stayed with Dad, who tried to make the darkness less frightening with a few candles, though the cold inside their living room continued to deepen. I knew they expected me to change my mind before midnight, yet I had already chosen to spend the evening surrounded by people who valued honesty and effort. My Aunt Marcy passed me a mug of hot cider, and for the first time that month, I felt the tension lift from my shoulders. The soft conversation around the table filled the room with a sense of belonging I had never experienced at my parents' home. As the snow thickened outside, I realized that this Christmas marked the beginning of a new boundary, one that would not bend under guilt or manipulation. 1 week after Christmas, I realized I finally felt lighter. I had spent the days after the holiday organizing my finances with a clarity I had not experienced in years. The steady routine of managing my bills, preparing meals for myself, and reviewing the work projects I had postponed gave me a sense of control that had been missing for far too long. My apartment felt warmer than usual, even though nothing had changed except my decision to protect my peace. Mom and Barrett were now responsible for every overdue notice and every penalty. I received several long messages describing the inconvenience they were facing, but I stopped reading them once I understood they were attempts to redirect accountability. The silence that followed my refusal to respond created an unexpected calm around me. I no longer carried the hidden fear that someone would demand something the moment I rested for a day. I no longer checked my phone with tension. My days became mine again. I returned to small habits I once loved. I cooked slowly in the evenings while listening to familiar music. I walked through my neighborhood without rushing. I learned how comfortable life becomes when no one is draining your emotional or financial energy. There was no reconciliation, no attempt from me to mend something that had already taken too much. My decision was firm because the truth had shown me how fragile my boundaries had been and how much strength it took to rebuild them. I understood that peace does not arrive by accident but by choice. I learned that generosity loses its meaning when it becomes an expectation rather than a gift. Pressure disguised as family duty can slowly erase a person's sense of self if they are not careful. Accountability cannot be borrowed, and trust cannot survive when honesty disappears. The moment I decided to stop paying for consequences that were never mine, I began to understand the value of emotional independence and the importance of protecting the space where my confidence grows. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Sharing it reminded me of how many people carry silent burdens hoping someone will understand the weight they hide. If my experience resonates with you, I hope it encourages you to honor your boundaries without apology. I appreciate every person who reads, listens, and reflects with me. Your presence gives these stories a meaningful place to land.